All right, we should be starting. Asim, would you like to?
Shaban, I think, has come in.
No, Dr. Bharat, this is photograph. Asim, please go ahead. Yeah, your video is on. Yes, let's start, please. Yes. Asim, please begin.
I don't see you.
I can see you. Oh, we're having some trouble with Asim Prakash starting, so let me do the honors of introducing this important panel with which we are beginning our deliberations on multidisciplinarity and its implications for contemporary Indian higher education. I hope I'm audible to everybody. Yeah. Yeah. I'm Padma Sarangapani at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and I welcome you all to the first of 3 webinars, panel discussions that we're organizing on the theme of multidisciplinarity and contemporary Indian higher education. And we're very delighted that we have 3 eminent speakers joining us on this panel, Professor Krishna Kumar, Professor Sundar Sarukai, and Professor Tejaswini Niranjana. And Professor Shalini Bharat, our director, is the chair of these panel discussions. The purpose of these panel discussions is to open up deliberations on the implications of the call of the National Education Policy on the need for higher education to become more multidisciplinary. Many of us have experienced multidisciplinary environments in our own education, but clearly when the NEP is calling for multidisciplinarity, it has something more than just a co-location of faculties and disciplines and multidisciplinary atmosphere generated by this kind of co-location. So this series of discussions that we have planned is to really enable us to engage with the concepts, the possibilities, and also enable us to make selections on where we will go with this idea as we integrate it into our institutional contexts. I'm going to introduce our panelists to you, and then I will hand it over to Professor Bharat to chair the session. Professor Krishna Kumar is among India's foremost scholars and commentators on education. Previously, he was Dean of the School of Education, University of Delhi, and Director of the NCERT. He is currently Honorary Professor of University of Punjab. He was awarded the Padma Shri in 2011. His recent research and writing has been on the theme of education of girls. Professor Tejaswini Niranjana is currently Professor of Cultural Studies at the Lingam University in Hong Kong. She was co-founder of the Center for Study of Culture and Society in Bangalore, which offered an innovative interdisciplinary PhD program. Her recent work has been in the area of music, and her books on this subject include Musicophilia in Mumbai and Music Modernity and Publicness in India. Sundar Sarukai is founder of the Barefoot Philosophers Initiative. He was earlier professor at the National Institute of Advanced Studies till 2019, and he was also the founder director of the Manipal Center for Philosophy and Humanities, which offered an interdisciplinary postgraduate program. His work is primarily in philosophy of natural and social sciences. His recent works, co-authored with Professor Gopal Guru, include The Cracked Mirror, An Indian Debate on Experience and Theory, An Experience Cast and Everyday Social. And he has recently also published a book titled J.R.D. Tata and the Ethics of Philanthropy. Dr. Shalini Bharat, our director, will chair the session. She is known for her work on social determinants of health with special reference to reproductive and sexual health, social aspects of HIV and TB, including stigma and discrimination. She has served as member of the mission steering group of the National Rural Health Mission and And I would, with these words, like to hand over to Dr. Bharat to make her preliminary remarks and get this panel discussion going. Thank you.
Good evening, friends, and a very warm welcome to all participants, and a very special welcome to our esteemed panel members. The focus on multidisciplinarity in higher education has re-emerged on account of the recently launched National Education Policy 2020. The NEP anticipates that in order to be relevant to addressing the major challenges of environment and society, higher education in India will need to engage more actively in research and teaching with several multidisciplinary approaches. Although the ideas of multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity have been around for several decades now, the mainstream of higher education in India, by and large, is organized around disciplinary training and teaching. However, disciplines have grown and expanded, and there are new forms of knowledge as well as methodological practices which need to become a part of the mainstream of higher educational institutions. At the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, an institute involved with research and teaching applied social sciences, we have developed interdisciplinary approaches in our teaching and research programs, as well as in our field action programs, drawing largely from within the social sciences. Today's panel discussion is an opportunity for us to examine more deeply what multidisciplinarity is, what it can offer in order to enrich teaching and research, how institutions can foster greater multidisciplinarity, as well as some of the concerns and disadvantages that we should all be aware of as we embrace it and move forward. As a director of the Institute, I look forward to the outcomes of today's deliberations in enabling us to set priorities for our future work. We are very delighted to have three eminent panelists with us today. I'd like to first begin with Professor Krishna Kumar to make his interventions. Professor Krishna Kumar, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Bharat. It gives me great pleasure to join you this afternoon. I realize that the Tata Institute of Social Sciences wants to deepen its engagement with disciplinary and interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary concerns. Of course, the Tata Institute has long experience with these concepts. Many of its alumni have gained fame for engaging with issues and problems that we might rightly call multidisciplinary. For instance, issues of displacement or famine prevention. Today, issues of air pollution, for example, or the health crisis that we are all going through. These are all described as multidisciplinary issues. What does that mean? Does it mean that the people involved in studying these issues and finding ways to engage with them are themselves multidisciplinary individuals? Or does it mean that the engagement with these issues has to be organized in such a way that different disciplines that constitute these issues can participate? I would like to engage with this issue by first distinguishing what learning means in the context of higher education. Learning is a word that we use to refer to all stages of education, but it has a distinct implication for higher education. It can't be simply the curiosity to understand, something that in schools we talk about. Learning at the higher education stage must refer to a sustained fascination and pursuit of knowledge. It has to be driven by a desire to be disciplined, so to say, to get one's mind trained for the pursuit of a subject. Now, that idea that it's a training of the mind for a long period requires that the person who is eager to get this training submits voluntarily to being disciplined. In fact, this word discipline almost immediately, once we use it in this way, reminds us of the word which is related to it, namely being a disciple. It's through this engagement and relationship with a teacher that the young volunteer who wishes to pursue an area of knowledge for a sustained period of time, it's through this teacher and relationship with the teacher that this volunteer submits to being disciplined. And that's where really the roots of the idea of a discipline are, that you agree to be disciplined, trained, that is, mentally, and also in terms of your conduct, which is required for pursuing something for that long a period in your life. Now, in this deeper sense, the word discipline and all other derivations from it, such as multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, etc., they all require us to reflect on the way in which these terms are now being used as a remedy for a problem that this new policy document identifies as the problem of fragmentation faced by university education in our country. If we were to diagnose the causes of fragmentation, assuming that it indeed has occurred, then I think the diagnosis has to go to the causes that might be held responsible for, or which can be linked with what we are today calling fragmentation of the system. And similarly, a remedy for this problem will also have to refer to the causes, why it has occurred. And if we do that, then I would say that multidisciplinary can't be a matter of simply creating departments for more subjects to be taught in a college or a university. Nor can it simply mean that many more combinations of subject matter in a certain field need to be directly faced, taught, and researched if we were to look at fragmentation as the problem that we face today. I think our diagnosis has to examine the conditions in which disciplining of the mind of a young person takes place under a teacher's guidance or in relationship with a teacher. The teacher's condition, therefore, is a very important variable for understanding fragmentation of higher education today, a word that the policy document uses. The teacher's condition is not simply conditions under which teaching is taking place, which is, of course, a variable, but the condition of the teacher as a person, as a member of the university community. Over the years, the marginalization of the teacher as a person has become a reality. And in this sense, what we face today in India is, of course, not unknown elsewhere. It's perhaps a problem we share with many universities, except that our engagement with this problem has been a bit skimpy. Teachers have been demeaned. They have been placed under great pressure. Some of this pressure was always there. If you look at, for example, the UGC's method of deciding how many hours a young teacher will teach or how many hours a slightly older teacher will teach. There's no question that kind of classification of responsibility has been very, very mechanical, and it has always put the Indian teacher, ever since one can remember, for the last many decades, under enormous pressure. And if you see it that way, perhaps excessive teaching has been going on in our universities and colleges. Teaching in the sense of direct lecturing or direct engagement with students in large classes. But there is a new pressure now on our teachers, the pressure to be productive. Pressure which has also taken a highly mechanistic form, because productivity now can be quantified, and quantified measures of productivity are used to recruit, promote teachers in nearly all institutions today. These are new realities of the teaching profession, and the fragmentation that the policy is talking about has to be seen in this perspective as well. And that, I would say, is the first level at which we need to apply our diagnostics on the problem of fragmentation before we hop on to multidisciplinarity as a remedy. Now, this being the first level, namely the condition of teachers, a second level can be recognized for looking at this issue, and that's the level of curriculum. How the curriculum for different courses is prepared and how it's transacted. Cultivating a disciplinary quest at all levels of higher education, starting with the undergraduate level to the higher levels, is a very important aspect of maintenance of the system. The curriculum in our system has been traditionally seen as a sort of bag of topics, topics which are considered prerequisites for learning. And very often those who prepare curricula at the higher education level have great suspicion of school education. Without much knowledge of what has gone on in schools, they assume that the students who are coming into first year don't have the prerequisites. And so curriculum at the undergraduate level often takes the form of a sort of a buffet in which different dishes are available, and many of these are being fed for a second, third, or perhaps 10th time in a student's life. In any case, recent nomenclature used by the higher authorities has been of a buffet. Choice-based curricular approaches, for example, remind us of this idea of curriculum being simply a collection of topics which serve as prerequisites for further learning. In any case, our history as a colonized country also makes us look at knowledge as a body. Used to be a book as a body. Now we can add to it many other commodities with the commoditization of knowledge having happened in the digital age at a great rapid speed in the last few years. All of these developments have made the question of disciplinary capacities as a goal of higher education somewhat opaque to us in institutions of higher learning. How exactly these capacities can be cultivated, how the recognition of the disciplinary element in a subject area or aspects of that subject area can be cultivated in the young mind, so that the young person doesn't see exposure to knowledge merely as exposure to its subject matter, but rather also learns in what manner is the kind of disciplining of the mind happening here. That awareness, if it were to be part of being taught in higher education, then it does require recognition as a major variable in curriculum designing. This whole process, therefore, will call for us to be historically more aware of the view of knowledge that our system has quite often failed to take since its inception in the later part of the 19th century. And that historical awareness of its various weaknesses and failures has to guide us into now engaging with this idea of making multidisciplinary learning possible in our institutions, in the sense that the disciplinary part of teaching takes precedence. To conclude, therefore, I would plead that multidisciplinarity is not merely a matter of nudging the present settings in our colleges, universities, and institutes. Nudging in the sense that we add departments, or where there are one-off courses in any one specialized subjects being offered, to add to them. That way, earlier committees like the one chaired by Professor Yashpal on rejuvenation of higher education have already engaged with this issue at great length. And this is not the occasion to remind us about their way of engagement. Their critique of professional education in particular in areas like engineering and medicine is based on this idea that we do need to offer a greater scope for accommodation of different disciplines in our institutions. The policy document unfortunately doesn't refer to that engagement of these earlier committees and simply offers the question of multidisciplinary expansion of institutions as an administrative process to be supervised and regulated as years go by, so that after a certain period of time, all institutions acquire this label of being multidisciplinary. I think such an approach will not remedy the problem we are facing. The question of autonomy of the teacher, question of the dignity of teaching as a relational exercise are centrally located in the question of how disciplinary training can become the core of higher education. In that sense, it's institutions that must recognize that they exist in order to serve the teacher, rather than the other way around, as we often think, that our teachers are serving an institution. Teachers are the institution, in fact. And the administrative, managerial paraphernalia that has grown now around the teacher, corporatizing the university and the institute, is in fact a threat to any kind of disciplinarity, let alone multi or interdisciplinarity. If the teacher is not able to demonstrate to the young student what it means to discipline oneself for a long-term pursuit of knowledge, if the teacher is unable to set an example of that, we can simply forget about any kind of disciplinary training in the young student. Certainly, it's a tall order to turn our institutions around to recognizing what it means to discipline the mind by promoting closer and more meaningful discipleship in the student. Thank you.
Dr. Bharat, you need to unmute yourself, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Krishna Kumar, for engaging with the issue of fragmentation of higher education and throwing some light on the causes and also the remedies around the issue. You've also talked about, how teachers are an institution, and that in the long pursuit of knowledge, disciplines have to be first engaged with, and a lot of issues that you brought out. Thank you so much once again. I would now like to invite Professor Tejaswini Niranjana for her intervention.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Dr. Shalini Bharat, for your gracious hosting of this event. Professor Krishna Kumar has already talked about how the NEP document is discussing the issue of fragmentation and the other problems of the current higher education system that it is trying to refer to. So I won't dwell on that again. But I do want to say that it's telling that multidisciplinarity is invoked through the many departments the Indian University of the future should have, ranging from literature and languages, translation and interpretation, music and dance, to philosophy, science, mathematics, sociology, economics, everything, right? So it appears that the mere proximity of these established domains of knowledge will produce the brave new world of the multidisciplined student. However, as again Professor Krishna Kumar has pointed out, the existing higher education system has its roots in colonial society and is premised on what the TISS note prepared by Padma calls a strong epistemic identity formation. This epistemic identity is closely tied to disciplines. I'm using the term more conventionally than Professor Krishna Kumar did. Closely tied to disciplines, whether pure or professional and applied. Disciplinary training, even in newer areas such as gender studies or development studies, determines access to resources like jobs, research grants, and publication opportunities. The somewhat entrenched disciplinarity of faculty members in any institution in India makes it difficult, if not impossible, to be enthusiastic about multidisciplinarity, let alone interdisciplinarity, even if both undergraduate and postgraduate students may be open to such explorations. I'd like to share two examples of curricular intervention with you in the hope that they will provoke further discussion today. One is the Integrated Science Initiative that I helped to develop at CSCS, my former institution, in collaboration with colleagues at the Indian Institute of Science. And the other is a program in Indian languages in higher education that I put together at TIS Mumbai. I know that Dr. Bharat did not mention that I was actually very closely associated with TIS. I worked there for 4 years from 2012 onwards, and I'm proud to claim that genealogy as well in terms of the kinds of questions I'm asking today. I'm glad I know there are people in the audience, I can't see them, who took part in one or both of these initiatives. And I'm sure they'll be able to elaborate a little more on the challenges that we faced. The Integrated Science Initiative was designed as a curricular initiative and the Indian Language Project as a resource building project. But it was designed to feed into curricula in a number of domains. First, let me talk about the Integrated Science Education Initiative. Its main objective was to develop new models of teaching science, models that would create the conditions for new kinds of research. We began by talking about interdisciplinarity, not multidisciplinarity, which suggests peaceful coexistence. We were talking about interdisciplinarity, which for us was about posing to disciplinary formations questions regarding knowledge production, and thus creating structured interruptions. I use the word interruption because these questions usually emerged in the context of research problems that could not easily be placed in the area of expertise of any one discipline. The methodological challenges of tackling such complex research problems were to be incorporated in our initiative into both curricula and pedagogy. And with discussions taking place across disciplines, we could eventually think of proposing a horizon, if not an actual goal, of integration. To address the issue of the grounding of interdisciplinarity, also referred to in the TIS note, the Integrated Science Education Initiative initially thought of building researcher collectives across the human sciences and natural sciences, with the idea that interdisciplinary research would at some point lead to interdisciplinary pedagogy at all levels. Although this trickle-down model sounds sensible, given the unique situation of Indian higher education, where the learning culture depends on being channelized or streamed at an early age, the barriers to thinking across disciplines erected throughout the school and college system are pretty well insurmountable. I'm sure all of us have experienced this. So we then rethought our intervention, deciding to position it squarely in the process of teaching and learning rather than in research. If students learn to ask new questions, they might be able to take their curiosity and creativity into the research level as well. What I'm discussing only briefly here has been laid out in great detail with sample curricula in the anthology called Breaking the Silo, which I co-edited with Anup Dhar and K. Sridhar a couple of years ago. I hope you have it in the TIS library, and I do hope if you haven't read it yet, you will take a look at it again, after we have finished this panel. So in the introduction to Breaking the Silo, we argued that the crisis in science education, proclaimed by the Indian Academy of Sciences in the late 1990s, mirrors the larger crisis in the Indian education system. In spite of widely expressed institutional desires to overcome it, this divide, often referred to as the two cultures divide, is a watertight one, with near opposed methodologies that are seldom in dialogue. The larger Integrated Science Initiative brought together over 8 years, 2006 to 2014, a number of participants across disciplinary and institutional divisions. These participants included people with backgrounds in physics, in biology, in computer science, sociology, medicine, philosophy, science studies, history, literary studies, film studies, cultural studies, theatre, and the visual arts. Bringing these participants' theoretical interest to bear on pedagogic practice became something of an action research project, if you will. Due to a combination of luck and opportunity, we were able to try out the new curricula institutionally, primarily on 3 sites: ISER Pune, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, and the Central University of Jharkhand in Ranchi. The courses in different ways inquired into the nature of the production of knowledge, which was the title of our first open or public course at IISc, designed as a series of literal dialogues between scholars from both cultures. There are many more details available in the book that I mentioned. Around that time, we also undertook a mapping of the diverse arguments being made for integrated science education through lengthy interviews conducted with natural and human sciences scholars in India and internationally. These are all available with ISER Pune, and due to lack of time, I will not be going into those arguments, which I think you can well imagine. They were about the questioning of the universality of scientific knowledge as it was proclaimed by its proponents, talking about the diversity of local contexts and local knowledge systems, and how we have to avoid the twin pitfalls of Western hegemony of the universalism on the one hand, and uncritical, ahistorical, traditionalist appropriations of knowledge on the other. I think this is very much a danger we are facing even today. So the separation of knowledge domains affects both natural sciences and human sciences. And I've often heard this argument that integration has to operate both ways. But this situation is far from symmetrical. The natural scientists typically dominate knowledge production, asserting that since scientific experiment leads to scientific knowledge, no other justification from outside the discipline, that is from the social, is required. The social sciences too end up being obedient to natural science methodologies. And this happens in the applied field as well. But in spite of widespread contestation of this obedience to natural science and of the domination of the natural sciences, these sciences are generally insulated from the self-reflexivity we were trying to promote through the Integrated Science Initiative. In our attempt to build integrated science curricula, we were inspired by the 20th century efforts in a number of places in India dating back to the 1950s, from Delhi University to IIT Kanpur to Chandigarh and other places. These efforts have been thoroughly documented by Dhruv Raina and his students in a landmark report commissioned by the Higher Education Program at CSCS, and a substantial section of this report is available in Breaking the Silo. Our approach in the initiative, whether in ISER, IISc, or CUJ, was different from earlier attempts at integration, which led to the setting up, for example, of the Humanities and Social Science departments in the IITs. This was primarily because we set up a dialogue with the natural sciences and invited natural science students to deliberate together on the limitations of exclusively natural science approaches. We also tried to show how both the natural and the human sciences would benefit from integrated approaches. So our approach was not based on the critique and dismissal mode that some earlier human science scholars had adopted, but on the call for a shared attention to what we were inquiring into. So we included courses on the history and philosophy of science to activate the reflexivity of science students, not to produce a glorious narrative of the triumph of science, but to understand the directions taken and not taken as science became institutionalized. At the Central University of Jharkhand, we tried out what might be called a strong program of integration, involving integrated themes, as we call them, such as evolution or cognition or health and bioethics. We showed to students how the resolution to a problem might not necessarily be a disciplinary solution. We argued in the process of creating curricula that integration meant producing knowledge of a third kind, one that was neither exclusively natural nor human scientific. I think I'm doing all right for time, so I would like to share with you an example of one of the courses that we developed. This was a course on cognition, the mind-body divide. It was developed by Anup Dhar in collaboration with myself. And this tried to address the human science, natural science divide, the neuroscience, psychology divide in thinking about cognition. This is a 4-day intensive course. I just quickly go through some of this and I can address more questions during the discussion. So we begin on day 1 by talking about mapping cognitive activity in the brain. We talked about neurological localization and we talked about artificial intelligence, asking whether the complexity of human cognition can be mapped in terms of computational methods or algorithms. Day 2, we moved to problematizing the brain-based study of human cognition. We looked at phantom limb pain. We looked at morality and mirror neurons, where we looked at questions of imitation, of social learning, of empathy. How does one learn this? We looked at aesthetic appreciation and suggested that notions of beauty are not context-specific and can't be explained by neurological account of brain structure. We ended the day with music, where we tried to discuss how familiarity to a certain kind of music and exposure to that music determines our response to it, which is not simply spontaneous and based or something that could be explained only on a neurological basis. Day 3, we moved to human science understandings of the mind with perspectives from literary theory, psychology, and anthropology. How did we do this? We talked about how cognitive structures and capacities were shaped by social experience. We made connections between unconscious processes, symbolic structures, significatory processes. We showed how signification, we arrived at signification through familiarity with cultural patterns and not through neural activity alone. We gave the example of Freud's famous mystic writing pad, where I think the students began to appreciate how the retained traces of social impressions were actually very much a part of how we remember or we recognize something. And day 4, which is the last day of the course, we ended with a discussion of how to challenge the restricted view of the unconscious in contemporary cognition research to received ideas of the mind. I'm sorry for this really sketchy overview, and the entire syllabus, many examples, and greater details are to be found in the book that I mentioned. The question of language in the Central University of Jharkhand. I must talk about this towards the end of this section of the discussion. There was a perception among the students that the language of science was English. Our attempt to create a multilingual classroom helped students to be less inhibited, and they were able to provide examples from local history and local social practices. The clarity of their articulation increased exponentially when the human science, natural science debates were also made available in Indian languages. For example, one instructor, Geeta Chadha, had students translate parts of Brecht's play, The Life of Galileo, into Hindi, which they attempted with the help of Google Translate. Enacting the scenes seemed to have left a deep impression on the students. In Jharkhand, Hindi was the default language for most in-class and out-of-class casual interaction with students, and several instructors tried to make the sessions too as bilingual as possible. In contrast, the IISc courses, the Indian Institute of Science undergrad courses, were more monolingual in delivery, given the linguistic diversity of the students. However, in creative assignments such as video making or theater workshops, there was scope to bring in different Indian languages. Our curricular design in the Indian Institute of Science benefited hugely from our earlier intervention in Jharkhand. So we were bringing that effort from Jharkhand to the most premier of science institutions in India. So a couple of years later, then we launched the mandatory undergraduate course in Humanities that is still running at IISc, 3 sequences across 3 semesters, ways of knowing, ways of seeing, and ways of doing. The first dealt with the question of method in ethnography, literature, history, and psychology. The second dealt with visual arts, film, and theater. And the third dealt with sustainable development and cognitive studies, suggesting that these were examples of how to do things with disciplinary knowledge. The feedback we have from ISC students indicate they're taking some of the learning from the humanities courses into their natural science and technology courses. We do see that what has changed or is changing is not just the object of inquiry, but even the perspectives that have produced them as object of inquiry. In learning about the methods of the human sciences in a natural science institution, the students have focused not on absorbing new content, but cultivating a way of thinking about a problem, a way of asking questions. I'm going to rush through the next part now. I'm sorry. My second example, how much time do I have?
Well, actually, Tejaswini, no. I think can you hold on to your second example? I'm sorry, and we'll come back to you.
Okay, I can do that. I was going to talk about the language program, but I can hold on to that. Sure. So I will take a break, and I hope someone will ask me a question to allow me to come back to the language issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Niranjana. I think, yes, of course, you were here at this, and that should have been included in the introduction. Padma, take a note of that. Thank you for bringing, to us your initiatives in integrated science education and the Indian languages project. It was fascinating to hear what you really meant by integrating knowledge and integrating disciplines rather than having just a peaceful coexistence of disciplines, which sometimes multidisciplinarity actually really refers to. So thank you very much again, and I hope there are questions on your second example. Sorry about that. May I now invite Dr. Sundar Sarukai to make his intervention. Over to you. You need to unmute, I guess. Yeah.
That we're not able to hear you still.
The buttons.
Now it's okay, I guess.
Yeah. Could you speak? Just try it out, please. No.
We still can't hear.
Yes. No, sir. So sorry, Sundar, we're not able to hear you yet. Yeah.
Is something pressed by mistake? I think
Can the host unmute him? Maybe he's unable to locate
can you hear me
the
now?
Oh, yes,
Yes.
we can hear you perfectly.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you, Professor Bharat, and thank you, Padma, for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to be part of this panel with very eminent scholars like Professor Krishna Kumar and Professor Tejaswini. They have said some parts of what I'd wanted to say, but it gives me an occasion to say something more about some of the topics which Professor Tejaswini was talking about. I'll first begin with a note which we have talked about earlier with Professor Krishna Kumar about disciplines and fragmentation. I want to begin with the observation that even established disciplines are multidisciplinary in character, and the best examples actually come from the sciences, and it is true for the social sciences too. In the sense that this debate predates much of the discussions of interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, and transdisciplinarity. If you looked at the question of physics using mathematics, people have often asked the question of what does it mean to use a different discipline called mathematics in a discipline like physics. And then the standard ways of understanding this, which many scientists might have problems with, that chemistry needs physics and mathematics, and biology is built from physics, chemistry, and mathematics, and so on. I mean, there have always been this movement across disciplines and an attempt to bring together. I think all the physics, chemistry, biology already exemplify a very classical, traditional model which has worked very well, and it has very important lessons about multidisciplinarity for us today. In social sciences, very often when we tend to talk about certain histories of their evolution, we have to recognize that many of them draw very deeply upon philosophy, for example, and that explains the fact that philosophy enters into social science discourse in various ways, even though it may not be explicit. And it also draws ranging from philosophy to literature to the natural sciences to biology, as we all know about the origin of the history of social sciences and its relationship to Darwinism and biology, for example. So there has been this kind of a dynamic engagement between what we might call as disciplines. But the question which Professor Krishna started with, the problem of over specialization and fragmentation, has very much driven the new ways of moving towards multidisciplinarity in a sense to take care of, at least at one level, to take care of the problems of the over specialization. And there have been many aspects of multidisciplinarity, both the speakers have said. So I want to begin with a kind of an analytical framework, and therefore I want to break this up into different parts. So I want to suggest how we look at the question of multidisciplinarity, one in research, and then the aspect of teaching, on which Tejaswini spoke quite a bit. And also I want to come back to a very important question coming from our experiences of trying to do these kinds of courses, which is the problem of evaluation. And I think it's one of the most difficult questions which multidisciplinarity raises. And obviously, the very idea of methods of doing multidisciplinarity depends on the purpose in each of these domains of research, teaching, etc. In research, as I said, multidisciplinarity has always been part of it at some level. It's been very deeply linked to innovation, and it emphasizes what has now become a contemporary social practice within science groups, which is the practice of collaboration. As we know now, more than a majority, a dominant majority of scientific papers today are collaborative. They have more than two, three, four authors and so on. And there are actually now a growing number which have more than hundreds in them. So the point is that multidisciplinarity does something in creating new forms of new ideas, new ways of thinking about problems, and so on. And much of it, and if I want to look at how it does it, I want to focus on one specific point in this short presentation, on just one point which I'll come back to repeatedly. And it is to identify the free play of concepts across disciplines. We have seen this in very many examples of new science disciplines which are formed, like biophysics, for example, and so on. There is the possibility that you could take concepts from disciplines and let them have a free flow in a completely different framework in other disciplines and so on. Now, of course, we know the way discourses are structured, that there are objects of discourse which may differ across disciplines and so on. But if you look at the free play of concepts, methods, the vocabulary, and sometimes objects of discourse, you can build new frameworks which then begin to define what multidisciplinarity. I think one of the most important empirical principles which really support multidisciplinarity work in the sciences has been just the spirit of testing new possibilities. So multidisciplinarity almost becomes as if a method to drive us towards thinking about new possibilities when we are stuck within certain kinds of constraints within disciplines. You can see this very similarly in social science and humanities, overlapping domains. If you look at the kind of objects of discourse, the methods from political science, sociology, anthropology, and to English or literature, you would be able to see, an enormous amount of movement of ideas and methods across these disciplines. Now, in the context of teaching and pedagogy and curriculum, again, I want to draw upon what was Tejaswini was doing, which is to look at some empirical examples of some of the ways by which my own engagement with this question has been. And one of the ways actually it first began to develop in a much more cohesive fashion was through the summer schools I used to organize when I was at NIAS. And these summer schools I felt were a very important way of engaging with students in the social sciences and humanities. So these summer schools were called Philosophy for, social science and humanities. And it was basically a recognition of the fact that the students in social science and humanities were drawing a lot of philosophical literature, vocabulary, and kinds of styles, if not argumentations. And I in my experience with students across the country in different institutions, I often find that there is a kind of a struggle to make sense of how do I then engage with these questions of philosophy, for example, or these different kinds of not just the conceptual vocabulary, but how to use them in their own work. And the fact that they were using that work is already present within their disciplines. It's not that they came in asking, how do I use philosophy? It's because they are already caught in that particular kind of discipline. In one of the workshops in Kerala, in Calicut, I was doing last December, a teacher in one of the colleges, a very well-known college there, who teaches English, got up suddenly and said, "Look, how do we teach somebody like Derrida and so on? Because all this has been given to us as syllabus, and they have to read Gayatri Spivak, Nancy, and then Derrida, Foucault, etc. And they're asking, how am I going to do this?" She was really confused about it, and that raises a very important point about the way we have imagined the new kind of contemporary work in these kinds of discipline. So the summer schools are a great opening for me because I learned a lot, and I think many of the students too did, because we even today we have a large number of them who are still in touch with each other, etc. And they've been not. It's not that they did philosophy, but it opened up the space of thinking about what they were doing in a more conceptually foundational sense. Now, what I did is then using these kinds of experience which I had with running many of these summer schools, when I finally decided to start a postgraduate program, I moved to Manipal University to set up the Manipal Center for Philosophy and Humanities with the hope that we would be able to build a truly interdisciplinary program. So we started with a master's in what we called as the interdisciplinary humanities. And for me, there is a particular reason for why I thought it was very important at that time in my career to set up a kind of a master's program to try and re-look at the questions of teaching interdisciplinarity in an effective way. One of the reasons which drove me to do this was, of course, the questions of fragmentations and discipline, but also the questions which, again, Tejaswini was talking about, the kind of distance which lay between natural science and the social science. I know there's been a lot of talk about epistemologies and knowledges, and as also the note, which makes a point about disciplines and the epistemic structures of them. But in my experience, being in the IISc campus for many years at NIAS and engaging with different groups in the country, I find that the distance between the natural and the social sciences, often defined in terms of certain kinds of views about knowledge, have been quite polarizing. And the fact that today, even today, it is so difficult to have a meaningful history and philosophy of science program in the country is a testament to it. And part of it, I mean, there are many reasons for it. There are questions about it, we can talk about it. But part of the reason why I then thought a kind of a way of looking at interdisciplinary humanities would do is to set up a program of what I thought would be a very rigorous program, where it was not about philosophy at all, because I don't believe that one can do philosophy, whatever that means, without knowing subjects like sociology and the Indian society in which one is part of, the local world in which one is part of. So what is it to imagine a master's, for example, in philosophy or sociology or literature, in which our philosophy students who came to this program had to do literature and sociology as disciplines, and the literature students who finally ended up doing MA in literature, for example, had to study philosophy and sociology. I mean, if there were scope for it, etc., maybe we might have added more disciplines, etc. But basically, the hope was that through this kind of having to listen to each other, learn the kinds of discursive practices of the different disciplines, that the students will learn to deal with the hegemony of disciplinary knowledge. And very importantly, driven by this fundamental problem of understanding scientific knowledge, and also the kinds of pressures we have had on the questions of social theory. In fact, that has been a larger project with me and Professor Gopal Guru in our own two books, but more than that, outside it, in many of the workshops and universities, including at TIS, by the way, on what does it mean to think of social theory. And why does that become a problem? I'll come back to that in my final part on the problems of multidisciplinarity. But our approach in doing many of this goes back to understanding foundations of disciplines, methods and concepts of disciplines, and moving away from a focus on thinkers and content alone. So it's what we saw was as a more liberatory project of learning, which makes them engage with new concepts in different ways. Sorry. Yeah. So, and the third point, which also which meant that we had to engage also with the local, as Tejaswini said, and for us it was, how do you make sense of the intellectual world and the societies we belong to? And this has always been a question for me. And again, if there is a question about it, we'll come back to it later. The fact that our science institutes today still do not understand the importance of science and technology studies, and the conflict about who teaches history and philosophy of science in India is very deep. There are so many programs, whether it's in universities or whether it's in these big IITs and ISAs, where scientists end up teaching these because they think they have a better right towards teaching this. And this question about why disciplines are being used for what social purposes is also a very important question dealing with interdisciplinarity. So what was the pedagogical structure which we used to do this kind of an interdisciplinary course? The way I conceived of it is to look at courses which we teach students based on concepts and history of ideas. And that was very important exercise and an experience for us, because there was no distinction between Indian philosophy, Asian philosophy, Western philosophy, for example, or similarly in the context of literature. And no artificial distinction between natural science, social science, and humanities. And to us, so for example, the first two courses you would have studied if you had come to the master's program there, where the first course was both semester long courses was reading, writing was the first course, and thinking and imagination was another course, for example. And the reason we conceptualized this was not to say, well, we are going to teach you what reading and writing is, but we actually talked about reading and writing, and through that developed questions and methods of reading and writing before worrying about which great writer we are going to read. And that's a semester long course. And here the point was not talking about one kind of use of reading or writing, but looking at different, where we drew upon from literary studies as to philosophy, from Indian thought and other thoughts, to try and see whether a student can really understand these concepts very well. So the whole course was defined on these kinds of concepts, what we thought were the most important concepts which captured this. And so I would say that to conclude on this point, that the walls between disciplines and cultures, which has been a great obstacle for multidisciplinarity, through this process, I don't think was dissolved. And the whole point was not to dissolve these particular kinds of disciplinary differences, which is very important to retain them, but it is just that the walls were made more porous at the level, at that scale where concepts could move across these porous walls. And through that, we were actually able to do many, I think, many interesting experiments. And I do think that students got a lot from that kind of an experience of learning interdisciplinarity. I'll end in the last couple of minutes with the problems of the multidisciplinarity which we encountered. And I think it is true. There are a variety of problems. I'm just going to speak on one specific part, because when in our own encounters with multidisciplinarity, I often like to describe it by saying that we belong to disciplines like we belong to political parties. We put on a flag and say, this is it, this is what I am talking about. And I think doing that at the level of teaching becomes a great problem. So what is the kind of open-mindedness which is needed for a truly multidisciplinary teaching? And here I'm just assuming that research is going to be multidisciplinary in character. A big problem which we repeatedly encounter, and we repeatedly encounter even today, which is that multidisciplinarity has been reduced to a kind of mimicking other disciplines. Mimicking could happen at the style of writing, for example, or the kinds of using concepts and then plugging it in to talk about what you are talking about. And suddenly through that, it seems as if we have already become multidisciplinary because we are just using these things in some sense. And the mimicking point, which I argue elsewhere, it's actually used as a methodological process, even in disciplines like philosophy, has raised, I think, very deep questions, because there are, in many multidisciplinary texts, people just don't understand what somebody else is saying. And that has led to one specific problem. And I'll just stop at that, because I think That was a great problem for me, which I saw both in the course we ran and also at an institute like NIAS, for example, which is how do you actually evaluate productions of multidisciplinarity, either as research or as in teaching and evaluating students and so on. And part of the problem is because when people look at multidisciplinarity, the kinds of questions they have and the kinds of response which comes is often like saying that multidisciplinary work is quite shallow. It does not possess the kind of rigor that is needed within disciplines. And so very often people tell us that, look, you have to be rooted in one discipline if you want to be multidisciplinary. All this is actually quite an old discussion in this particular context. But I think the question about what does it mean to define rigor within multidisciplinary practices, and the question of in evaluation, who is going to be evaluating multidisciplinary work? What kind of skills as an evaluator do you need? A person who is going to handle different disciplines, or is it going to be one discipline? One of the reasons why philosophy of science that has been so difficult to establish in India is because of the fact that at the level of students, in many of our attempts to start it, the first question is often this, that who will be the students? It's only science students who should be doing philosophy of science, or can non-science students do philosophy of science, and so on. I mean, the point is that spreads into so many other kinds of multidisciplinary practices that very often I have had to fight repeatedly the belief that it's easy to do multidisciplinary of science, and that it's not as difficult as you're going to do in sticking to one discipline. As I said, I think a lot of it has to do with our inability to understand or come up with matrices of evaluation, since there are not enough journals which publish it, etc. I'll just end with a final point about one way in which I think meaningful teaching of multidisciplinary content is possible. And we have tried parts of it, and I think it's a very difficult, ideal approach. But I think one of the most important things about multidisciplinarity is not just bringing in different disciplines, but bringing in different teachers to teach the same subject. So in other words, teaching together, like learning together, is a very important principle of practice, which to me underlies the practice of multidisciplinarity. And what does it mean to teach together? How do teachers actually learn to teach a course together without just coming and saying, it's my module, I'm teaching this, it's that module, I'm teaching that? And I think a truly good multidisciplinary teaching has to go back to these basic questions about teaching and learning, which are, I think these are questions are always been there, but to come up with new practices of doing these, doing teaching and learning to our students. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sundar, for this very, very interesting talk, where you talked about, you reminded us about the dynamic engagement of disciplines actually without us knowing it. And then through your examples of, doing these summer schools and interdisciplinary programs, you actually threw up a whole lot of ideas and issues and concerns, including of how to evaluate and so on. I think these are the kind of issues we were talking about and we need to be looking at as we move into, doing this multidisciplinary work. And as you know, you've also been associated with this, that we have already been engaging, but we wanted a bit more clarity and conceptualization along with other scholars. So thank you very much. I liked your statement saying that disciplinary boundaries need not be just thrown away, but they have to be made more porous, and that's what probably interdisciplinarity will be all about. Thank you so much, and I would now like to hand over to Padma for the next segment of question answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bharat. So a couple of questions that I'd like the panelists to respond to. These have arisen from our own deliberations and partly provoked by your observations today. Krishna Kumar referred to the importance of the relationship between teachers and learners in higher education and reminded us that it's not just content delivery, but it's really induction into ways of thinking. And Tejaswini has tantalizingly referred to the language program that was an attempt to develop resources. Sundar has reminded us about the importance of the local and bringing in the local in pursuits of inter and multidisciplinarity. I was wondering if you might, all three of you, like to reflect on the implications of diversity in clientele in higher education today in our institutes, and the possibilities of more experiences of social reality entering into the classrooms of higher education, not something only to be learnt on the field, and how you think about this from the lens of multidisciplinarity. Professor Krishna Kumar?
I think the issue you are raising, Padma, has to do with meeting the student halfway. Yes, our classrooms now represent a much greater range of social existence. They are more diverse, etc. And that puts the teacher under a far greater responsibility to meet these students from different backgrounds, so to say, halfway. Now, how does one do that while you are yourself situated in a social reality from your background? One answer to that question has to do with giving student experience a greater say in how classes are organized. That means to recognize the different kinds of problems that students from different backgrounds and their interaction with others will invoke in ways of entering into dialogue. These are issues to do with mother tongues, competence in English, time available for such interactions in a typical Indian class, etc. These are all very key issues, and very often we ignore the reality of the student in our planning for curriculum, our planning for a lecture, and so on. In fact, Pierre Bourdieu, as head of a committee, had pointed out that we have to have very solid data about our students' day-to-day life. How does this student travel to the college? How does this student spend the evening? What does it mean to be in his or her shoes? Is an important aspect of that student's reality, which the teacher must recognize. And not simply the institution, but the teacher also needs to recognize in order to be able to relate to that student. Now, these, of course, invoke the specter of difficulties arising out of numbers that we have to deal with. Even some of our major universities today are dealing with 100 students, 150 students in a single class at the master's level, and so on. And certainly this kind of engagement becomes very difficult if we treat that as a given or as a compulsion. But I think the point you are raising is extremely relevant to our understanding of what does it mean to induct a student into a disciplinary quest which is going to last for a long time. And in this very fundamental sense, every discipline already has elements of other disciplines which need to be hinted at, acknowledged, and sometimes just pondered on while students and teachers are learning about a certain topic. It's not possible to engage with history, for example, without suddenly become aware, oh, there was politics involved all the time, or that the geography matters, where it was happening, and so on. And these are the moments where student engagement in a diverse classroom will become immediately so interesting and so necessary to acknowledge, and then to make it possible for it to be fully articulated.
Thank you. Tejaswini? We can't hear you, Tejaswini. You have to unmute.
Oops.
Yeah, you're now on. Yeah.
Yes, I am now. Yeah, thank you for helping me to come to TIS in the first place in 2012. It's because of that I was able to set up this program for Indian languages in higher education. And I just want to say something about the rationale for this program. It was that the generation of knowledge in Indian languages would not only create new intellectual resources, but transform the teaching learning process in positive ways, since you asked about this teaching learning process. So the default medium of instruction at the tertiary level is actually a local language, rather than the mandatory English. And there's an enormous linguistic divide affecting the majority of tertiary students in the country. So investing in Indian language resources, materials at the basic and advanced levels is a sustainable way by which Indian higher education can be strengthened. In the Indian languages program at TIS, we worked with individual faculty members on all the campuses and their collaborators in the cities of Mumbai, Hyderabad, Guwahati, Tuljapur, to produce new teaching materials in Marathi, Gujarati, Telugu, Malayalam, Hindi, and Bangla. Most of these projects have been completed, and I hope they're safely preserved on the TIS server. Unfortunately, since I left TIS in mid 2016, I couldn't ensure that these resource books were published. But the Wikipedia workshopping with students in Pune, Calcutta, Mumbai, and Hyderabad has ensured that the multilingual entries created by the students across many disciplines are now part of that widely used digital resource. Most of our languages, as we all know, cannot sustain teaching and research in the context of the modern university and the disciplines. We need to create critical vocabularies across several conceptual domains. Students need to learn the ability to distinguish between levels of meaning, to contextualize, to translate, and to create new concepts that capture the life of our societies and our institutions. I think Sundar has been talking about precisely this. And in doing so, they have to learn to draw on multiple linguistic resources. We cannot delay the entry of Indian language resources into the mainstream of higher education any longer, because by doing that, by bringing multilingual resources into the national educational structure, we'll be expanding the analytical abilities of these languages and making the curriculum more relevant to the society we live in. So I'll just stop by mentioning that my two examples, the first one being the science one, and the second being the one about Indian languages, are very different from each other. But seen one way, the Indian Language Initiative can help interrogate the disciplines by drawing attention to the gap between the language of social and cultural practice and the hegemonic language of the social sciences, whether theoretical or applied. So to engage productively with the language issue in India may in the end be a far more complicated project than to engage with multi and interdisciplinarity. But I think we can see the two projects as intertwined, as both related to the problem of institutional change, both working to enable the transformation of the premises on which we produce knowledge.
Thank you. Sundar, please.
Yeah. So let me rephrase the question slightly, because I think none of us here is going to have any question about the importance of diversity and inclusivity within classrooms. In fact, the richness that it brings to the classroom is something which is not even, it's something which we know for granted, we take for granted. But in the context of this discussion, I want to rephrase the question slightly to ask, what should we change to make inclusion possible? And I don't mean just policies and saying have so many people come in, etc. More importantly, the question which I think is important to me is, how should disciplines be changed? And I raise this point because when you teach, for example, for specific disciplines, let's say physics or psychology, and you might have standard books which we then use to teach these courses, and you could go anywhere in the world and you know that you're going to be reading these seminal texts. And we do this across in so many disciplines in the social science humanities too. And the question we really need to ask is not how do we include students by taking them out to sit with us, and the question of language, which they just only talked about, is extremely important, but also to what kind of disciplinary changes do you expect before we say, I'm going to teach this book, or this is the knowledge system which I want to transmit to the students. And so part of that exercise has also been very much a struggle which we have had when we have tried to do these courses, and with this focus on inclusion. One is the question of ownership of ideas, of course. You rewrite disciplines so that the people in the classroom have a ownership of ideas and so on. But the more important problem, and I'll just take a line to talk about this, is that the problem of theorizing, or whatever is loosely called theorizing within these disciplines. It has become such a deep problem within many of the social science disciplines and humanities disciplines, and which is what drives people to, as I said, mimic disciplines rather than have more deep engagement with them, because the nature of theorizing is what actually creates hierarchies within the class, and theorizing, the idea of it is exclusive in various ways. So the inclusiveness is not just in bringing them physically to the class, but in intellectually bringing them by challenging the fundamental presuppositions of what theory means and the relationship between theory and experience, which is the point which really drove Gopal and me to start our work together. What is that relationship? Because all theorizing has to be ethical. It's something which disciplines resist all the time. And how do you then modify the fundamental structures of a discipline in order to make it more inclusive?
I think that was really what I was getting at, because this interaction with diversity of clientele in a way makes these questions inescapable.
Yeah.
We cannot authentically conduct our activities as faculty without squarely facing the question of what the discipline means and how we are going to become practitioners of the discipline, not just communicating somebody else's knowledge to a body of students, and not just transmitting the discipline, but using the discipline to think through common experience, I think. And definitely the Indian language questions intersects with that very fundamentally, because it really provides us with the need for new vocabularies and concepts to be revisited. In relation to this, partly engaging with some of the issues that both of you referred to and Krishna Kumar also alluded to in terms of the teaching project in multidisciplinary spaces, would you be able to reflect on what kinds of objectives is one teaching for or teaching to in these attempts to build multidisciplinary programs? Is it possible for us to look beyond the possibilities of perspective building and orientation to something which is more rigorously demanding in terms of acquiring ways of becoming disciplined? So if you have some reflections to share on how we think of learning outcomes, objectives in teaching programs, leave alone the question of evaluating research. Professor Krishna Kumar?
I suppose there's a whole gamut of decisions involved in responding to what you're saying. These are, you might say, decisions of a practical nature, which need to be informed by a certain ideal, a sense of an ideal about what it means to arouse in the student the realization that what she or he is pursuing has a certain history of its own. It's a certain way in which this knowledge can be pursued. Each subject area carries the imprints of its own evolution. And it's very important for a student to begin to notice that evolutionary process of that subject area while the student is sitting in a class or listening to a teacher or doing something that the teacher has asked the students to do. Very often, these issues are relegated to simply a topic called history of the field or how it evolved. And that's really not going to serve the purpose that we are talking about, where a student becomes aware that this is not merely sort of knowledge as it exists today, but this is knowledge in the making. And that's where colonization becomes a very palpable reality in our classrooms, that we are used to thinking of knowledge that's now available as sort of all ready to be absorbed. Very few of our students recognize that knowledge is in the making, and that there is no such thing as knowledge which is available to us now for application. In fact, the current corona crisis has brought about this recognition among many for the first time in our younger population, that science is not something which has ready-made solutions available to problems of health. Health itself has, for the first time, it seems during this crisis, in the lives of the young become a matter which now they relate to knowledge in the making, so to say. And the fact that it took a big pandemic crisis like this for this recognition to occur in younger minds, and in some cases even in older minds, itself speaks of a grand failure of the education system, especially the higher education system. If the higher education process had all these decades conveyed this idea that knowledge didn't all sort of get ready in the West, and now we are here to consume it through all these products and commodities. If that idea had not become so sort of assumed an idea of how our education and our curricula are structured, then surely there would have been some realization that there is no such thing as knowledge being available somewhere, and all we need to do is to buy the latest books or look at the latest on the following websites and so on. These are all ways of engaging with knowledge in a colonial way, and the system has to extricate itself from that that historical bind on our minds.
Thank you. Tejaswini? Yeah.
I'm not sure, Padma, I can address the question in the way that you framed it. So I'm trying to find another entry point. I know that today, whenever we put a curriculum together, we talk about learning outcomes, and that's the language of the day. But it's true that when faculty members in many institutions are trying to frame a curriculum, that they are unable to actually explain what that curriculum is doing. So even though, like I remember that on your invitation, actually so many years ago at this, when I was doing the faculty induction programs, we started talking about what does it mean to craft a learning outcome. And we have been so used in our education system to just go there and lecture or just pass on disciplinary knowledge that we don't actually worry about what any particular course that we have designed is trying to pass on, or rather trying to communicate in the teaching and learning process. So it has been quite a concern for me when I look at wherever I am teaching, whether it's in Hong Kong or in all the work I'm doing in India, continue to do in India, that this lack of articulation of what the learning outcome might be. I mean, although I hate to use the jargonized word, but this is, I think, something important we need to think about. So the kinds of cognitive skills that I know that is sort of thrown around in the NEP, but I think it's something that we can reframe and think about again. That what do we mean by cognitive skills? What do we mean by forms of knowledge that we are engaging with? Because there is such lack of reflexivity on these things. And even in terms of many faculty members know that the curriculum needs to tick these boxes. But then when it becomes a rote exercise to even produce those bits of text that fit in all those boxes. I know that increasingly all institutions all over the world are doing that. So what does it take to defamiliarize that process and say that we need to think about what does it actually mean to build a cognitive skill? Yeah, this is something that does worry me a lot. Yeah.
In your own curricula that you have designed, have you been able to articulate learning outcomes that may not actually expect students to work with concepts, but be able to somehow acknowledge and value perspective building, which may not actually signal disciplinary mastery?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't juxtapose, or I wouldn't contrast perspective building with disciplinary mastery, because I think those are two very, very different kinds of things. I think that many of the disciplines I've engaged with, whether it's gender studies or cultural studies, there's been a phase in these when perspective building has been the most important objective. And while that has been communicated, it speaks to people's personal experience in a certain way. And I think it's quite easy for young people in particular to pick up on how to sound like that. And it's not, So it's not to say that one shouldn't do perspective building, but to say that one needs to be a little more aware about, what is one actually learning in that process. Because it seems to me that.
Sorry.
Oops.
Yes, where the sound is coming from. Okay. Thank you. Sundar, yeah.
Someone was muting, unmuting, whatever. So sorry, I lost track of what we were doing in this noise.
No,
But just to say that it's to me is quite difficult when I'm if I were to teach a course, which I try not to do, which only depends on perspective building as a main objective, it becomes difficult to surface the cognitive skills that one is trying to put down as a learning outcome. So it's not that working within a discipline helps you to articulate the learning outcome. I don't think that's the case. Yeah.
Sundar. Sundar, you have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Sorry about that. No, I think the point which I want to add to this is the fact that, when we struggled a lot with thinking through these concepts and what we should be teaching the students, one point was always a major stumbling block for us. So that is, we first had to convince the students that the learning objectives we think which drives this particular structure is meaningful to them. It's not just that, for example, to say, I know I have a clarity about what I should be doing. So a lot of energy was actually spent in dialoguing with students to say, look, this is not a new kind of a framework we want to put, we're replacing it with something else, but this is meaningful to us in the context of learning. And one of the ways by which I used to argue it, and it's a very simple point, which I'm sure all of us as teachers do it, but I try to operationalize it as a kind of a method of teaching through different kinds of subjects, is based on the idea that is based on a particular presupposition of all disciplines and major disciplines that we talk about largely, right? And the classical traditional disciplines, that they're based on the idea that knowledge is something outside us. I'm going to talk about society. I'm going to talk about, political processes and so on, or about electrons and atoms and stuff like that. The real challenge for me in bringing this multidisciplinary perspective on teaching was to rechange it and say that how does a question of autonomous self-reflexivity happen in the context of your learning about things which are obvious, may seem like outside you. In other words, the questions of class, caste, and gender, for example, are not imposed as external disciplinary framework, but as something which arises internally when we ask the question, how does this play out in my context of my self-reflexivity of learning in an autonomous sense? And all these are problematical terms, but it was really aimed towards moving towards that really set the kind of structures and practices we have. I'll give you one very quick example. Over the last couple of years, or definitely over a year and a half, I've been doing a lot of workshops for children. It's called Philosophy for Children. And when we started it, everybody said, what does it mean to do philosophy for children? And, to me, the whole idea of bringing philosophy for children, which I did with a group of my students and who are part of Barefoot Philosophers now, we do that quite a bit now. We go around and teach children, and what we teach them in the context of philosophy is things like thinking, reading, writing, and so on. So finally, the book which I wrote, which will come out soon, it's called Philosophy for Children, Reading, Thinking, and Writing. I mean, reading, writing, and thinking, where the practices of this autonomous self-reflexivity through the questioning of the disciplinary knowledge they get and through the practices of multidisciplinarity arise organically. So the end of it, they need to ask, what am I doing when I'm writing this sentence? That's enough. And I think philosophy has a great role in doing this, or multidisciplinarity. I don't see philosophy as a discipline in that sense. This multidisciplinary approach has a great role in doing that.
Thank you very much. I do have a last question, but I think we've run out of time. I wanted to ask you for your recommendations on disciplines we should be engaging with at TIS going forward if we wanted to forge a multidisciplinary project more explicitly at the Institute, which is extensively worked with interdisciplinary social sciences. But so far, we've had limited interaction with the humanities and the natural sciences. But I'm going to leave you to mull on that and come back to us with your suggestions. I'll hand it over to Shaban to bring this really enriching panel to a conclusion.
Thank you, Professor Padma. Are you able to hear me? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So thank you. This has been a fascinating discussion and also talk by Professor Krishna Kumar, Professor Sundar Sarukai, and Professor Tejaswini Niranjana. And their talk has largely revolved around conceiving multidisciplinarity, delivering multidisciplinarity through the curricula and issue of learning outcomes. I'm not going to, highlight many points of their talk, but some of them are worth noting. For example, Professor Krishna Kumar, who is not only a philosopher but also practices that, how actually he highlighted how the fragmentation of disciplines are harming the holistic teaching. And he said that institutions rather than making institution multidisciplinary so that they can create that kind of environment. So this and Professor Tejaswini also pointed out that and that actually harm only the sciences. Professors brought very powerfully that how the polarized discussion on disciplinary knowledge has become this kind of knowledge in social sciences to that kind of knowledge in sciences, and how they have to meet together in order to create holistic emerges out of that in the discussion, out of this actually conclusion we can bring that what the panel has pointed out and remarked by our Vice Chancellor, Professor Shani and Professor Padma, that interdisciplinary is key basically to holistic understanding of phenomena, and also it is important for understanding of the complexity of the phenomena, and this is important that we develop and deploy diverse disciplinary lens to understand the phenomena. It is also advantageous in the pedagogical practices. It also helps promoting critical thinking among the students. That is what actually is emerging. And we are very thankful to eminent panelists who joined us today, Professor Krishna, Professor Tejaswini Niranjana, and is speaking with us and being with us on this important issue. We are very thankful to Professor Shalini Bharat for encouraging us to engage with this issue. And all of you may not be knowing, a team of senior professors under the guidance of our Vice Chancellor is engaged in Tata Institute of Social Sciences with this issue. And we are very thankful to Professor Padma Sarangpani for taking the lead in this issue and also connecting with the panelists and actually creating the framework for this. We'd like to have further discussion on this issue, and I'm sure that we will come back to you. And thank you all once again for joining us and being with us on this important issue and talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.